that and this is directly related to Pinker's statement, that we have to teach kids to understand the tools that we use to process text, to think about problems, to develop strategies around the use of text. And so part of our interest here was, what can we be doing early in children's school careers that is unrelated to text processing, but is in terms of print, but is related to the way they think about their world and the things that are communicated to them through the text that they're reading. And the 2000 National Reading Panel also talked about this idea of comprehension being really complex and involving intention, that you had to actually intentionally interact with what you're reading in order to understand what an author is trying to communicate to you. And that this, we believed, perhaps could be taught. That at a very early age, even before children were reading text on their own, they could learn about intentionality of reading. They could learn about how authors are trying to communicate something to you. And you'll see this theme reflected a little bit later when I tell you about the nature of the program that we developed to try to build early reading comprehension. So I want to take you back to your early childhood days for a moment. How many of you are familiar with the book Dogzilla? Oh, now this is not good. You cannot call yourself a reading researcher if you don't know some great classic children's literature like Dogzilla. So I won't read it to you, but Dogzilla is a story about, that is a parody on 1970s B movies of Godzilla. And it's all about a country of mice that were under attack by the great Dogzilla. I think in the 50s. And it's about dog breath. You know, they were trying to escape the dog breath, and there's reference in the text about the big cheese. Right? Who's the big cheese? The commander of the army. So I want to go to the next slide. I want to ask you the question with that context. So thinking about, that's a commonly read book in schools and libraries and in homes in some places in the United States. But what do children need to have in their toolkit to understand what that book is referring to and to make sense of it, even before they can read it? So if I'm a parent reading that book to my child, what does a child need? Just take a couple minutes, talk to each other, and tell me what you think children need in order to understand that book. So what are your ideas? What kinds of things do children need to understand that text? And let me acknowledge up front, there's really no wrong answer here in some ways, because there are levels, right? You could, if you go back a slide, so you could just look at the pictures. And what story does the picture tell? But you could also understand it at very different levels. So what kinds of things do you need to recruit in children in order to benefit from reading this book? This is not a ritual thinking.
You need a context of even their language about animals or animal relationships, process of a book, beginning to end, all those kind of things.
Right. I mean, part of what's humorous here is the mouse-dog relationship, right? Because we don't have a cultural, in the US, we don't think about mice and dogs kind of in the same. It's always cats and mice, so that's sort of a funny thing. And they need to know something about sort of the mice feeling subordinate to dogs in terms of size, and what else?
be helpful if they knew who Godzilla was.
So at a very high level, right, the humor here about Godzilla, because much of the text is written in dialogue that comes directly out of Godzilla movies. We used to watch on Saturday afternoons, right? So, you know, it talks about this beast and how would we control him. And of course, what about dog breath?
Oh, I just caught that.
What's that?
I just caught it, sorry.
Oh yeah, so, you know, they're talking about his, see the odor?
Yeah.
How this is like his weapon, right? His dog. What else? So there's these reference to movies, which you may or may not know. You could still benefit without it, probably.
There's wars and machinery and hierarchy and
Great, so there's
big cheese.
conversation here about battles and leadership, the big cheese, right? All kinds of interesting little humorous references as well. So you get this, what we were trying to understand is how do you help children begin to think about this before they're the readers? Like how do you get them to begin to, what are the pieces of comprehension development that, that help children benefit from what is read to them? Go to the next. And to the next one. So in the research literature on comprehension development, we have spent a tremendous amount of time focused on comprehension strategies. And in fact, roughly when the National Reading Panel did its synthesis in 2000, of the roughly 300 studies on comprehension, most of them, a large number of them, were done on how adult readers read strategically, right? So they weren't about children, they were about the proficient reader. Actually, it was called the Proficient Reader Studies, out of the Center for the Study of Reading at the University of Illinois at the time. And they looked at what adult readers did and said, if adult readers do these things, then we should teach children to do these things. So advanced, so are you familiar with the Institute for Education Sciences? Some of you are. And you know the What Works Clearinghouse? If you're a teacher, this is kind of an important resource for you. So the What Works Clearinghouse is represented by a website. And this website, if you could go back one. Sorry. This website publishes these practice guides that are essentially practice guides for teachers to alert them to what the best evidence is in any particular area that they've, where there's a large enough knowledge base to begin to synthesize it. So in comprehension, these are the 5 evidence-based practices that we should be employing in classrooms. And you'll notice, stay there for just a minute. You'll notice that there are levels of evidence. The levels of evidence are minimal, moderate, and strong, but they're all evidence-based, meaning that just because there's minimal evidence doesn't mean there's no evidence or that there's bad evidence. It means that there's professional judgment and some evidence to suggest these practices are important. But you'll notice the only one that has strong evidence is teaching comprehension strategies. So that's an interesting bit of information. And by the way, all of these syntheses were done after this intervention was developed and implemented. So let's go to the next slide. And I'll give you the conceptual framework for this study. So Charles Perfetti at the University of Pittsburgh and his colleagues created what I believe is, for us, has been probably one of the most helpful models of a reader, a blueprint of a reader, that we frequently refer to when we think about the kind of whole package of how reading develops. And one more clip. This red box down here represents decoding. Right? So visual input and the orthographic and phonologic relationships in an alphabetic language and word representation. So that's sort of what we, in the Reading First program and many of the reading initiatives that happened in the 90s and early 2000s, we spent a great deal of time trying to improve classroom practice inside this red box. How do we help children read words and text independently? What we didn't spend as much time on is the next click, which is this bigger set of skills and knowledge. So down the left-hand side is really, in this blueprint, is the language development components. So orthography and phonology and the mapping between those, and I know many of you study this carefully, that's one component of it, and you see that directly feeds a student's ability to read a word and make sense of the word. But then there's the lexicon, the development of our understanding of word parts, the morphology, as well as how those play into definitional terms, our lexicon, our understanding of words. And then there's this more integrated linguistic system where we move between phonology and syntax and orthography. And these three things, by Perfetti's and his colleagues' judgment, impact different parts of our ability to make sense of text. So we read the words, we try to develop some kind of a mental representation of not just the words but the phrases, and connect that to our general knowledge of the world. So if we go back to Dogzilla, much of a child's time, whether they're being read to or they're reading it themselves, is spent A, decoding the words and trying to develop representations of those words, then creating some kind of a mental representation of what Dogzilla might look like. And in this case, how does the book help? By providing pictures, right? Common thing for us to see. And then by Perfetti's model, this is where we begin to make inferences. We draw inferences from the text based on our general knowledge, the knowledge the author's giving us, and perhaps other texts we've read, or in this case, reference to movies. So this is sort of a big picture view of comprehension that we were particularly interested in exploring its relationship to classroom practice. Let me stop and just see if you have questions or comments. Does anyone here use this particular conceptual model in the work? Okay. Let's go to the next. So here's what we know. We were interested in what happens in classroom practice that we could leverage to impact comprehension. And we knew from our experience that first grade teachers spend about 30 minutes a day reading aloud to children. Universal, in the United States at least, it's universal. Sometimes it happens right after a break, sometimes in the morning. It tended to be kind of an informal time in first grade classrooms. Sometimes children would select the books and the teacher would read aloud to them. So we were very curious about whether or not there was a way to make that really a powerful instructional time. And when I come back to my discussion, I'll tell you some of the hazards of thinking that you can take teachers' non-instructional time and turn it into instructional time. But that was our goal. And there have been a number of studies done on read-alouds and their impact on children. I just tried to give you a quick summary here. First of all, we know from some of the literature that this is a ubiquitous practice in US schools. We also know that there have been some syntheses done. The Works Clearinghouse did a synthesis on read-aloud intervention studies ages 3 to 5, for children ages 3 to 5, and there were potentially positive outcomes for early reading and writing, and for the outcomes were mixed for oral language development, whether or not it actually improved oral language development, and there was no discernible effects for print knowledge, meaning could children read words more effectively as a result of read-alouds. But some indication that it did help their reading, probably as we anticipated a comprehension level. A more recent and kind of more comprehensive synthesis of the research that Lee Swanson did would suggest that there are positive effects on language outcomes, language development, some effect on phonological awareness, which could be an interesting conversation in and of itself, depending on where that came from. and print concepts and comprehension, with all relatively robust effect sizes over 29 studies. So again, all of these were done after we created our intervention. So keep that in mind. We were really trying to explore something that we hadn't seen done in very many places. So here's what we hypothesized, that we wanted to know whether a first grade teacher teaching a read aloud approach could impact whole classroom reading achievement in first grade. And we expected that the read aloud intervention would be effective with lots of kids, but most effective for students who are at risk for language and literacy difficulties. So that was of particular interest to us. We expected that children who are at risk for language and literacy difficulties would perform, their growth would be better than students for whom there were no difficulties. We anticipated that if you didn't have language and literacy difficulties, this probably would be an enjoyable time in the school day, but it might not necessarily boost you beyond where you already were performance-wise. So we were interested in measuring the impact on listening comprehension, a receptive comprehension measure, and 2 expressive comprehension measures, which I can tell you a little bit more about in a moment. We were also interested in its impact on vocabulary. And we were going to break vocabulary down into 3 categories. Vocabulary that was explicitly introduced in the read aloud. Vocabulary that was present both in the control classrooms and the treatment classrooms, but that was not introduced directly to children. That was category 2. And then category 3 were words that were not introduced to anybody. Just did it build better vocabulary knowledge, or did it have any impact on it? So we hypothesized that students who were in the treatment condition would outperform the comparison group on categories 1 and 2. Any questions or comments? Okay. We also thought that exposure differences might be interesting to look at. So that's where these 3 categories come from. We wanted to know if you were explicitly taught, did it impact your knowledge? If it was introduced but not, you didn't spend time on it, would that exposure change your knowledge? And then where there was no introduction at all. So we were trying to look at variation in exposure to words. And finally, we were, in all of the previous studies, we had not seen a tremendous amount of impact on vocabulary outcomes. This comes from work that Dr. Simmons has done and others. We were also, that was sort of our interest in category 3, what happens to other general knowledge of words. The side of this that I don't have represented graphically anywhere is the approach to instruction that we were employing. So kind of roll back to my point is we wanted to find somewhere in a first grade day that wasn't already being used to teach something else to see if we could impact literacy development. So we targeted this 30 minutes of read aloud time. And we wanted to use an explicit instructional model that scaffolded children's development, that used sort of a teacher read aloud, teacher think aloud approach, explicitly taught, with lots of opportunities for kids to also model or respond to questions about the text and see how the text worked. So we were interested in impacting vocabulary knowledge, comprehension of specific text. This 3rd bullet is particularly important. We were interested in how narrative and expository or informational text related to one another and how that developed in children's thinking. And then we were trying to demonstrate that knowledge through retells, interviews, and independent comprehension measures. So let me tell you a little bit about this curriculum. I'll use the term curriculum or instructional program kind of interchangeably. I think that's a ambiguity in our education professional language that sometimes people don't sort out. But this was sort of an 18 weeks of instruction, taught in 9 two-week units, which was already a major shift for teachers, because are any of you first grade teachers or former first grade teachers? So most, just tell me if this is accurate, but a lot of first grade teachers probably select books to read during Read Aloud, either thematically, as it links to something else they're teaching, or they're kind of random about them, or they might be based on the time of year.
Right.
Is that fair?
Yeah.
So we were trying to say, for these 18 weeks, we'd like you to give that up and join us on this sort of 2-week units and spend 2 weeks on 2 books, which is not typical either. Usually there's more used. So we tried a lot of things initially. We tried to link social studies here. It was an absolute disaster. Partly because there are no really good social studies text written at slightly above first grade level. So if you want to make it a lot of money, write some really good, roughly second grade social studies text. It would be useful. So we landed on science. We really focused on science rather than social studies. And just to give you a sense, the units were kind of lined up to the various standards in science. The children had to learn about various animal groups. And we did a pre-unit on amphibians, just because kids in first grade thought that was really cool. And then we jumped into mammals and so on. There were 2 books per unit, and we used both narrative, kind of classic children's books, connected to some kind of informational text. So I want to give you an example of this so you have a really clear picture of how careful we were at choosing these. So we had a book written about crocodiles. That was 32 pages long. And it had great photoreal sort of examples of crocodiles in their habitat, their reproduction system, what they eat, where they live in the world, etc. And then we selected a book called Bill and Pete, which is a children's story written by Tommy DePaulo, who's a very famous children's author in the US, who often writes about Texas. But the book Bill and Pete is about a crocodile whose mother is taking him to school for the first time. And one of the things she tells him he has to do before he can start to attend school is he needs to learn to brush his teeth regularly. So she takes him to the grocery store to buy a toothbrush. And there's a series of shelves, and there's the human toothbrushes, and then there's the crocodile toothbrushes. And the crocodile toothbrushes are Egyptian plovers, a bird. And so Bill and Pete, Bill, I believe, is the crocodile, Pete is the bird. In the crocodile informational book, there's a section about Egyptian crocodiles and how they have this symbiotic relationship with Egyptian plovers. So when the crocodile eats something, the plover goes into the side of the mouth of the crocodile and picks out the food from between the crocodile's teeth, thereby keeping the crocodile's teeth clean, but also feeding the plover. See that? So we tried to draw out these relationships between the relationship in the book between the 2 animals and the reality. How this author used real knowledge about crocodiles to write this book. Does that make sense? And we did that in every book 2 sets of books we introduced, kind of helping them see the relationship between informational and narrative text. I think we can go to the next one. So each 2-week unit had 6 or 7 lessons. One thing we tried really hard to do, the first 3 years of this project, we worked closely with teachers as kind of research partners. I'm looking at the first grade teachers so you can understand what we were trying to do. But we were trying to make sure we didn't totally co-opt their classroom into this project, but rather made it feasible for them to implement. And partly what they told us is, we cannot do this for 10 days. We could commit to 6 or 7 every 2 weeks, but you need to give us a little freedom to do some other things as well. So we were good with that. So we did 6 or 7 lessons per 2-week unit. And the informational text, they would read or discuss about 200 to 300 words each day within the text. And we made sure that they made it explicit to children that good readers do not read informational text from the beginning to the end, but rather they go in and read the parts that they're most interested in knowing about. So they can look at text features like titles and subtitles and pick out the things that are most interesting to them, because that's what we do, right? We don't, how many of you read your textbooks from cover to cover? Or the newspaper? Someone does. Or 1 in 40 of us do. Or newspapers. We don't read newspapers from start to finish. We read the parts that are of most interest to us. So we wanted to make sure that that was explicit to children. The narrative texts were 3 to 4 lessons, and those were reading front to back. The lessons were 30 minutes, about 5 minutes of the 4 reading activities, 10 to 15 minutes during reading, and 5 to 10 minutes of after reading. And we were trying to get from the teachers, and we provided suggestions for how to extend those lessons. Okay. So units 1 through 3, these were scaffolded, so we expected teachers to be primarily in control at the beginning, and then to release that control of the processing of the text over time. So the first 6 weeks, essentially, teachers did a lot of demonstration, thinking aloud, modeling how they would connect text to text and draw from their background knowledge. In units 4 through 6, there was a lot of guided responding on the part of the teacher of children's knowledge, kind of drawing out from them what they knew, the connection.
Sorry.
Too much pizza.
Lucky.
I was a high school teacher, Eric, so I almost did. And then units 7 through 9 were really asking the children to do most of the work in terms of talking about the various parts of the text. I mentioned we had this before, during, and after organizational structure. Many of these things you all will be familiar with. We used a KWL, Donna Ogle's 1986, probably before many of you were born, KWL program, which really helps. In fact, we think of this as much like your dissertation if you're a doctoral student, right? You have to first put together what you know about the area, and then you identify your research questions, what do I want to know, and then you do the work to find out what you learned. So we used a KWL structure here. We focused in the narrative text a lot about personal responses, because that's where first graders are in their lives, right? Their circle is about this big, and if it's happening inside that circle, then they have something to say about it. So we wanted to keep it close to them. We also began to build their knowledge of character clues, and setting, and what happened first, next, and last kind of structure. We learned the hard way that a problem solution effect structure was way too complicated for first graders, that we needed a more episodic approach to thinking about it. And then we always had them assess about whether or not they liked the story, just to kind of begin to learn how to evaluate. Is this good? Is this not good? What do I like about it or not like about it? So you're familiar with KWL, we can jump over that. Within KWL, the kinds of things we tried to generate were information about animals in general, then specifically what does it look like, what does it eat, so trying to get to some key features of science in terms of animals. We had some not particularly sophisticated, but some follow-up things like which ones have hair and which ones have backbones that we would kind of draw from some reference pages and such. This is our story structure map. So we wanted kids to begin to think about stories in this sort of sequence of who was the main character, what happened first, and we used footsteps to represent what happened first, what happened next, what happened at the end. And then this is where we had them rate whether or not they liked the story. So either they liked it or they didn't like it, and then we could have part of the discussion like that. So this is really the heart of the instructional intervention. By the way, I should warn you, if you're a statistics person and you're waiting for the results, I'm not the statistics person. I'm going to tell you how I understand the analysis, but I am the intervention person. So I build how we try to change behavior. and my colleagues do a lot of the, well, did we and what do we know? So, so before reading, we did spent a lot of time helping kids identify the purpose of reading. So why do I read this? If it's informational text, what do I want to learn here? Previewing. So all of these kind of fall within that strategy instruction kind of literature. And then predefining critical vocabulary. So we pre-taught critical vocabulary before they encountered it in the text. Through photos, often through photos, or through some sort of graphic. During reading, we tried to use this consistent framework to discuss text, either the KWL or the story structure model. We used a lot of question-asking strategies to kind of get children using kind of a QAR, Taffy Raphael from Oakland University. Again, not blazing new trails. These were sort of bringing together some things that people had never put together in one area before. Making connections. This is a reference to the Isabel Beck and Maddie McCowan work called Text Talk, where they engage kids in discussing text and making text-to-text connections and text-to-self connections, text-to-world connections, and then trying to help them build inferences. Very challenging for a 5 or 6-year-old to inference. It's not easy, right? I mean, they, again, because they have to draw from someplace else that's likely to be outside of this circle to make connections to something they're reading about. And then after reading, we practiced retells. We demonstrated them, we talked about the key features of retells and modeled them and reviewed them, and then we extended vocabulary work. Within this, during reading, when we encountered the vocabulary we wanted to teach, of course, we also called them out and taught them explicitly. Questions about any of that before we look at our outcomes? Are any of you doing intervention work of this nature? Some of you are? Yeah? Okay. So a little bit about our study design. This was a random, so after 3 years of development where we worked with teachers, did some pilot testing, we were then funded to do a second sort of 4-year, those of you who know the IES world, an efficacy trial. This is where you randomly assign classrooms to treatment and comparison groups. The one significant limitation of this study is that because children were nested within classrooms and we were using whole classes, we had 12 schools participating. Each school was assigned to treatment or comparison. We didn't have 2 teachers in school implementing. We were worried about having a treatment and comparison in one school and leading strategies across, so we found 1 teacher at each school and then randomly assigned those 12 teachers to treatment and comparison. So we have 6 treatment classrooms and 6 comparison classrooms. The students, and I'll tell you a little bit more about this in a minute, but they, around 50 to 60% were low risk, meaning they didn't demonstrate any performance challenges on either pre-screenings of literacy or listening comprehension. 28% and 30% were at language risk only, based on the test of oral language development. And 12 and 13% presented some literacy risk based on the Dibbles measures. And then there were a few children in both conditions that showed some combined risk, meaning that they scored in the at-risk level both on TOLD and Dibbles. The teacher characteristics. So most of them were female, not to be surprised, in first grade. Primarily white. Half of them were above the age of 35 and half of them were below, roughly. 5 of them had master's degrees, and most of them had been, their average years of teaching were 12 to 15 years, fairly senior team of teachers. This study was done in 2 sites in suburban Portland and in Eugene, Oregon. So that's partly why you see sort of a homogeneity of classrooms. 54 to 56% free and reduced lunch. And yeah, I think we can go on. These are the measures. So in order to classify children into these 4 categories of low literacy, low kind of at-risk in literacy, at-risk in language, combined and not, we use the test for language development and the DIBELS. And then we gave a measure of the listening comprehension subtest of Gates Begin at 8, which is not an easy assessment by any means. We also then developed a measure of vocabulary knowledge depth. So this is a complicated one, and I'll send you the paper if you're interested, but these are 17 words. A handful of the words came from those that we explicitly taught. They were randomly selected from those that were explicitly taught. A handful of them came from the words that were in the total number of words introduced, but only appeared in units 7 and 17 because those units were the ones that were taught in both the comparison classroom and the treatment classroom. Now, the comparison classroom didn't teach the intervention. They were just given the 2 books and told to use them during their read aloud time. Because that was our best way of trying to figure out whether or not exposure to those words actually was differentially impacted by the intervention. And then a handful of the words were general knowledge words from common words used in first grade children's text. And, oh, I should say one thing more before we look at the results, is on the depth of knowledge, we asked them to both define and then use the word. So there was a 4-point scale. They could get 2 points, up to 2 points for defining it somewhat correctly, and 2 points for using it accurately and in the context. Any questions about the measures? You're a very quiet group.
Yeah. Were any of the students second language learners? Especially the at-risk
I
ones?
believe not.
Okay,
Yeah,
so all of them are monolingual?
Correct. Although we have published other studies on this program in Philadelphia and in Southern Oregon, where we had substantial EL populations, and Fairfax County, Virginia. Yeah, we've studied this one to death, actually. And our results have been pretty good. Not differentially favoring English learners, but slopes for growth were as good for English learners as they were for monolingual English students.
And then when you say explicitly taught the vocabulary, how did you explicitly teach it?
We would define it in student level, kind of student-friendly terms, show them a picture, and if possible, use a synonym. So they had a synonym they were familiar with, for example. I'm trying to conjure up a good example for you, but let me think about that while we're talking. See if I can get you. So you can see this very clearly, I'm sure, from your seats. We were interested, of course, in looking at these different at-risk groups. So we were really very interested in looking at a model of the data that was an interaction model to see if we saw differential performance based on one of these 4 groups. And in fact, the main effect model was fit the data much better. So you're always looking for just the right thing, right? That's going to impact kids with language needs more than everybody else. But we didn't find it. In fact, we found the kids who were most proficient going in were the most proficient coming out. And however, we did see improvements across the board, and I'll show you a little bit about that in a moment. But we saw significant improvement on narrative retell, and we used the SNAP, which is a narrative retell measure that's been standardized. I think it's called Standardized Narrative Assessment or something. And the format of this is children look at a wordless picture book and listen to the story on a recording, and then afterward they are asked to retell the story without looking at the pictures. And you count the number of features of the story that they can recall or retell. So, but we saw improvement in the intervention significant improvement in the intervention over the treatment. We also saw significant improvement in vocabulary. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Not in listening comprehension, and not in the expository retell, although the performance in expository retell was approaching significance, so that indicated that there might be something there that we could hold on to. The standardized effect sizes for those two significant areas was 0.42 for narrative retell and 0.93 for vocabulary improvements. So this is all about vocabulary, this particular slide. And again, we were looking for category 1, the words that were explicitly taught to children in the treatment versus the control not. In category 2, those that were exposed to both groups but not explicitly taught. And category 3 were those words that were selected from a common word list for this grade level but were not taught or exposed at all. And we found positive effects for every category. Modest effects for the unintroduced words, only 0.17, but 1.05 for the explicitly taught words, which is encouraging. If you're going to spend time teaching vocabulary, you would like children to actually learn the words, and evidently they do, so that's good. And 0.65 just for exposure through the read aloud process. That favored the explicit instructional group versus the comparison group who got exposure to the stories and informational text but did not have the instructional scaffold. So, next. These are the standardized effect sizes, controlling for pretest scores, kind of across the groups. I think most importantly, because the main effects model fit the data best, this is where we got the 0.42 for the narrative retell and 1.02 for vocabulary. The expository retell was 0.25, which we weren't unhappy with, but we would obviously would have liked to have seen it be more powerful. If we're going to spend 18 weeks of instruction, you'd like to see good things happen. Okay. So what does this tell us? And I want to repeat, this is 7 years of work, right? And so we're excited that folks at Michigan State, Nell Duke, and folks at Ohio State, other people are also doing this work that's contributing to a growing knowledge base about this particular time that teachers spend in classrooms and how they might optimize its impact. So I mentioned our significance. Let me just get down to a couple of highlights and then I'll stop. But most importantly, we were interested that you could actually have an impact on these what are thought to be higher order skills. Thinking about text, even before children can read independently. That they can think about how texts work, how they relate to one another, that an author is actually communicating that information. There are some important things to learn and know about books. And that is beginning to be demonstrated across a number of other studies too. There's a trade-off here. I mean, we spent a tremendous amount of time planning, structuring these lessons, doing professional development for teachers to explain why they're done a certain way and how to do them well, tracking fidelity to the intervention, etc. And this is not realistic in first grade classrooms. I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. And by the way, we've tried to do almost everything but give this idea to publishers to get them to publish it. And nobody wants it. And the reason they don't want it is because the books are, they could buy the trademark, that wasn't the issue. We even went to Scholastic, which owns almost every book in the world. And they didn't want it because books go out of print. So one of the challenges for us has been how do you convey the lesson design and the approach without doing it through the books, those particular books themselves, and that's just a challenge. And also, is the amount of work worth the payoff to teachers? I think is a question that many first grade teachers shared with us. And the other thing is we were taking away their read aloud time, and they literally saw it that way. By our telling them they had to structure lessons in a certain way during read aloud, the 1 30-minute time of the day they didn't have an instructional objective, was tremendously burdensome for them. And one teacher told us she was just doing her own read aloud at another time. It was so important to her to preserve that kind of relaxed read aloud time around books that she was adding another one. See that?
Did you have in any of the studies a group in which the first grader teachers were just doing whatever they do in the read aloud without using these books?
That was our comparison group.
But they had the same books.
Only for 2 weeks.
Okay, so for the rest of the weeks they were using their
Their
own
own.
books. Okay.
We only had them do those 2 weeks because we wanted to look at that vocabulary exposure question.
Okay.
Okay, next. We are convinced, however, that the integration of narrative and expository books is really important. And Nell Duke and others have demonstrated this in their work as well. That if you're a first grade teacher and you're not exposing kids to a lot of expository text, one, it appears that a lot of first graders prefer expository text anyway, and they get lots of stories elsewhere. But two, we think that there's something really important about helping children understand how these relate to one another. You know, that stories just don't spring up out of nowhere. They're based in reality, or can be based in reality. And then I mentioned that our study is limited because of the unit of analysis is the teacher, because of the nesting of the data. So let me stop and see what overall questions.
Hey, do you have any plans? One of the things that's really a hot topic right now in the literature is examining learner characteristics associated with responsive intervention. I think most of that, and they've done some work in that area, has been done with mainly with decoding, including awareness and so forth. Do you have enough measures in your data that you could do kind of a similar non-responder analysis for comprehenders and vocabulary treatment resistors?
I don't know. That's a good question. So using the same data set, you mean, or across our data sets?
Yeah.
Possibly, particularly if we went back to some of our studies that were not RCTs and looked at just response versus no response based on characteristics prior to. I mean, we did, I think we did 6 large-scale studies in various urban, suburban, and rural areas. They were not all RCTs, but we have the same intervention implementation, the same data collection. We just didn't always assign classrooms to a treatment versus comparison. So we could look at response. It's a good question. Lena may want to dig into that. I should tell you that we've published a number of book chapters and articles, and one article in the Reading Teacher about this, trying to sort of promote structured read aloud kind of approach. And various ones of us have taken leads on these. This particular paper is in this year's some volume of the Elementary School Journal, and Scott Baker was the lead author, a colleague of many of ours at the University of Oregon. Other questions?
I think I missed 2 things that you mentioned. Number one, did you say that the read aloud did not have any significant difference from listening comprehension?
That's correct. On the told. Which could be, I don't want to be one of those researchers who tries to explain away the bad data, but could be because of the told. The nature of the told not being terribly sensitive to an 8-week time period. But I don't know of any other explanation for that. But listening comprehension measured by a standardized measure, the test of oral language development, we did not see a significant difference between treatment and comparison. We saw differences in retell, which was listening comprehension, just measured differently.
And
Oh, I'm sorry. It was the Gates-McGinnity. I'm sorry, Gates-McGinnity listening comprehension, not the told.
you use Gates-McGinnity as a listening comprehension.
Correct. And that's where we did not see the difference significant.
Well, you can blame it on the instrument.
That's right.
It was not meant for.
It's not meant
measuring
for
listening
sensitivity.
comprehension.
That's right. Well, no, there's a listening comprehension subtest of the gates for young children.
Oh.
So it was designed for listening comprehension, probably not designed for a short window of behavior change.
Yeah, I think there was fidelity, I think you mentioned that there was fidelity for the experimental group. Was there fidelity also for the control group?
We observed during weeks 7 and 17 to see what they did during those exposure periods to the vocabulary, but we did not observe teachers across the 18 weeks in the comparison group to see what they were doing. We have teacher logs. They reported that they did them every day. They did read aloud every day. They varied the books. They read the books. They talked to kids about the books. It was fairly standard operating procedure for read alouds. Mostly kind of in a relaxed transition from one subject to the next or after lunch. But they did engage in the read aloud.
I'm struck about the word intentionality, because you mentioned it as a component of the RAND reading comprehension definition.
Right.
And in that case, it's the intentionality of the reader and the text, and assuming the student is the reader. But we're seeing a lot of teacher read alouds, even in middle and high schools. And I'm just curious about if you thought about asking your teachers what their intentions were when they read those books. And it would be fascinating, I think, to think what are they really expecting to happen on purpose for those.
Actually, we did not do that work, but other people have. I mean, there is a literature around read aloud about, I don't know that you would call it systematic research, but there's been research done that does kind of ask teachers why they do them. And much of it is related to wanting children to like books. I mean, to sort of see a value in them, to enjoy them, which is obviously a laudable intent. But it's not instructional in the sense that they're wanting to learn content or vocabulary. I think the early sort of survey work in this area would say that most teachers would see that as a secondary outcome. But their primary outcome is to let kids be part of the selection process, to let kids hear stories and sort of learn to enjoy books, and for the teacher to be able to demonstrate good reading behaviors. I think that's probably a primary objective as well, and to show why they like them, why they enjoy reading. All good things, just not what we were most interested in.